Welcome to Conversations with Barbara. I'm Barbara Kanellopoulos, and with us today is Skip Finley, who is here to talk about his prize-winning book, Whaling Captains of Color. Welcome to the program, Skip.
Thank you very much, Barbara. I'm delighted to be here.
Congratulations on your awards. I understand that in 2021 you were Author of the Year, awarded by the U.S. Naval Institute, Institute Press, and then in 2020 an award for the nonfiction award from the Afro-American Historical Genealogical Society. So congratulations for that.
Thank you.
And there's so much to unpack here that I thought we would start with a kind of who, when, what, where, and why. So the who, of course, are these whaling captains, and the what they were doing is killing whales. But tell us when all of this was going on.
Right. Whaling was an industry that actually helped found America, that was actively pursued in our country from the late 1600s till specifically 1928. For most of those years, for many of those years, whaling was the fifth largest industry in America. It was also the second most dangerous after mining. So it had a lot of variables. But if I were to summarize the business for you, which I want to do fairly often, over that period of time, we took about 15,000 whale trips. They were conducted by about 2,700 ships and 2,500 captains. We now found out some of whom happen to have been, people of color. Over that period of time, my number, nobody's really said that before, but I think over those years, whaling was about $11 billion industry total in today's dollars. Wow. So that's the first part. So people wonder, where'd the money go? Nobody really has that question. But in fact, whaling was this important to the American industry. That was where the money came from to both build our railroads and finance the Industrial Revolution.
Really?
Yeah. So whale oil literally greased the skids for the modern Industrial Revolution we still enjoy today. Yeah, we also found out a lot of other things about it. We know there are about 175,000 people who participated in whaling over the years. Probably somewhere between 30 and 40% were people of color, which is a factor no one really knows. It's not logical to think that African Americans in particular had any opportunities, prior to and up till the end of the Civil War, and perhaps right through Reconstruction in the early 1900s as well. So the business was very useful for a lot of reasons. Another thing people don't know about whaling is whaling has pretty much charted the oceans of the world. All right.
Wow.
Yes. Whaling has accommodated for our weather. And even today, one of my associates, Dr. Tim Walker, is working with the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute. And what they're doing is going through all 3,500 of the existing whaling logs that are extant to look at all of the places where they know what the weather was. They're going to track that weather from all these logs from back in the 1800s until whaling stopped, and see can they project that weather going forward.
So you kind of traced this from whale oil to shale oil, full circle.
That's correct. That's correct.
Now, what was the cost of whale oil at the very beginning?
Well, it ranged. It ranged, and it's a little bit confusing for lay people. Whaling proceeds are three. One is the oil that we pretty much know about. One is the baleen that we know about, but we don't. Baleen is the bones. They call it a whale bone, and it has a peculiar feature. Once it's heated, it stays in that shape. So that was used for buggy whips and umbrellas, and a host of things from that. The other product from whales, besides the oil, besides the baleen, was a product called ambergris. Ambergris is actually illegal to touch. Ambergris, ambergris. It was used as the foundation for most perfumes.
Right.
So whaling has had its impact, not just on America, but on the entire world. Now, if you want to factor that a little bit closer, fundamentally, all of whaling occurred in 75 areas around the country. Probably 90% of that occurred on Martha's Vineyard, Nantucket, and New Bedford. Yes,
Oh,
there was
yes. In your book, you call that area the Middle East of America.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And for most of those years, in fact, we were the Middle East. Whale oil stopped being an effective product in about 1857 when shale oil was discovered in Pennsylvania. Okay, it's a lot easier to dig oil out of the ground and process it than travel 4,000 miles out to sea and take your life in your hands with which to do that. And that's when the switch was made from using the oil of whales to the baleen.
To the baleen.
And of course, in those times, not without coincidence, those around the 1850s, which is when many whalers escaped the Northeast and went out to find gold on the West Coast.
Yeah. So now these whalers were a pretty mixed bag of group. I mean, you call them cooks. Tell us about the people, the men who went out to the sea in ships.
Okay. Whaling was awful. That's probably the best single word description I can give you. But let's put it in the terms that they were familiar with. Or actually externally take a look at whaling. Of those 2,500 trips with 175,000 men, approximately 30 to 40% of everyone who went onto a whale ship deserted.
1 year.
Approximately 95% of all people who went whaling once never took a second trip. Okay.
It was
nothing about whaling. Whalers were fed worse than enslaved people and soldiers. Their food was bad, their water was undrinkable, their food was inedible for most of the time, and then factored that the average whale trip lasted from 3.5 to 4 years. The longest whale trip was out of the Nile, which was 11 years and 10 months. So imagine being aboard a boat for a week is a hell of a long time, but now you're talking about 3 to 4 years.
Yes.
So it wasn't a lot of fun.
Yeah. Someone said in your book that it was so bad, the vermin, and you could saddle a cockroach. Good heavens. No wonder so many of them tried it for 1 year and then gave up. And it strikes me too that in one of your book makes me think that it's very good to know that there are human beings who are made of such stern stuff. But you also say it was for the men of color, the captains of color, it was the lesser of two evils. What did you mean by that?
Enslavement. I wrote an article in a recent Martha's Vineyard magazine, which is the cover story. And here's a part of that. Now, what the story is about is an enslaved man who escapes by going on a whaling trip, which we discovered, as it turned out, the captain of the ship was a whaling captain from here on Martha's Vineyard, where I live. Anyway, let me just read this passage. Luce, the captain, looked at the man in front of him and informed him the usual punishment on a whale trip would be a serious flogging. Thompson was well acquainted with the practice. In his memoir, he told of growing up on a plantation where the owner made a practice of periodically whipping enslaved workers for no reason other than a little whipping being, as he thought, necessary in order to secure the humble submission. He'd seen the same owner force one slave to flog another, the husband his wife, the mother her daughter, or the father his son. He'd seen a woman die from the whipping she received for supposedly stealing a glass of rum, and an 8-year-old girl whipped for breaking a dish. He'd witnessed his own mother whipped until she could not stand. My feelings upon hearing her shrieks and pleadings may better be imagined than described. He had himself been whipped multiple times, once to the point where he couldn't move for 5 weeks.
Yeah.
Now, if you'll consider that paragraph, for a moment, with a business, I've been asked fairly often, well, what was the worst thing about, whaling, a whale trip? One thing was, there's a quote from a person who says they didn't mind being covered with roaches at night because they ate the bed bugs. Now
I
the
see.
foxhole where most of these men stayed, you had about that much room, space-wise, 2.5 feet, and about 5 feet in length, and that's where you hung your hammock, so it would swing when the boat rocked, and you'd still be able to sleep. There's no air. It was nasty. There was no light. It was pretty disgusting. You can't even imagine how it smelled. But that actually wasn't the worst thing I heard or read. The worst thing was they washed their clothes in urine. Because the alcohol ammonia content would cut through the grease. Now I got to say, how the hell dirty were your clothes?
Yeah. Yes.
That urine was a reasonable alternative.
Right.
So that should give you an idea of what life aboard a whale ship was like.
But Skip, it was lucrative. I mean, all that hardship, they did it because there was money to be made.
Yes and no. I've also done some homework on the money part. I used to be in the money business when I was in media. Overall, whaling from start to finish, their returns, their profits was about 4.6%. Okay. The American US bond, all right, has performed at about 4.5, 4.6% as the safest investment, that you can put your money in. So whaling wasn't that attractive overall. Now, having said that, yes, there were men who came back with 3,000 barrels, okay, at a time when, whale was selling for $2.50 a gallon, and each barrel holds 35 gallons. So that person was a millionaire in the year and a half, 2 years, 3 years it took to go out there, find those whales, and come back. Obviously, that wasn't true for most people.
Yeah.
Okay. Of those 2,250 whale trips, whale ships, whatever it was, we probably lost 700 or 800 of them. No one knows what happens to them. No one knows how much oil they had, if they had any. So those are some of the things that you deal with. But overall, 4.6%, $11 billion over about a 200-year period of time is not all that lucrative, particularly when you add the dangers to it. Yeah. Now, there's another way of looking at it. You could say, in fact, is that being an average, that half of them did substantially better and the other half did substantially worse. Well, that half that did substantially better built the city of New Bedford, built the island of Martha's Vineyard, built the island of Nantucket, and goodly portions of Sag Harbor.
I see. That's quite a story. But that unbelievably, some I'm like Paul Cuffey, is that how would you pronounce his name?
Cuffey, correct.
Cuffey. You say that he built a dynasty, an unlikely, but how did all that happen? That he became quite prosperous and also left others in his wake who also had a good opportunity. That I think you say that was a combination of marriage, kinship, a number of issues. So let's tell us something about Paul, who is one of your captains of color.
Okay. Paul Cuffey was amazing. You can't say enough, positive attributes about the man, but he does suck all the air out of the room in whaling. We Americans have a tendency to lock on to the one fact we're familiar with. Paul Cuffey happens to be one of those. But let me summarize Paul Cuffey. He was born to a formerly enslaved man and a Native American and indigenous woman on the island of Cuttyhunk, where he was born. Some of his family still lives on Martha's Vineyard, went there. Most of them went to New Bedford, where he did. And he lived in the Dartmouth community. By the time he was finishing at his death, Paul Cuffey owned 197 acres over there in the Dartmouth, Mattapoisett, New Bedford area. Now think about that. Here's a man whose entire life and it was lived before the Civil War, was able to codge together, quite a bit of land. He also, I'm going to talk specifically about his whaling in a second, but why was he notable? He was also an abolitionist. He was friends literally with the family that began whaling over on Nantucket and took it over to New Bedford. They all became friends. So Paul Cuffey and his brother decided one day they would like their children to be able to go to an integrated school. And of course, because they were African American, Native American, they were denied. Paul Cuffey built the first integrated school in America, which people don't know, for which he's entitled to, quite a bit of credit. Yeah. Now, coincidentally, Jim Delgado, Dr. Delgado, who does the program Draining the Oceans, which some people may have heard about or not. Essentially what that does is they go out in the ocean, they find a ship bottom of the sea, they suck the water away, then you can see what the remains look like. He gave me a call because they found a ship called Industry in the Gulf that had sunk in the Gulf of Mexico. He wanted to know, was that Absalon Boston's? I suggested it probably wasn't because, over that period of time, it was a small boat anyway over in Nantucket. It was more than likely scrapped. But I did look into the story a little bit more and found out the sunken Industry had a sister ship with them called the Elizabeth. The Elizabeth saved all the men and took them all back to New Bedford. I looked at that. Well, as it turned out, ironically, 3 of my captains sailed in that ship, and 3 or 4 of them owned that ship, one of whom was a man named Richard Johnson that absolutely no one has heard of. Richard Johnson took 20 whaling trips, Paul Cuffey 17. He used 7 ships, Paul Cuffey 8. He owned 14, Paul Cuffey owned 14. He sent out 41 trips with another black owner, Paul Cuffey sent 13. We know that Richard Johnson produced about $500,000 in revenue from whaling. We don't know what Paul Cuffey's was because it was so much longer. There are 2 other people, Pardon Cook and Thomas Weiner, who unsurprisingly whaled at the same time, were related to, friends of, almost family with Paul Cuffey. Richard Johnson whaled from 1831 to 1865. Pardon Cook, 1841 to 1860. Paul Cuffey, 1806 to 1821, and Thomas Weiner, 1804 to 1811. So now, if you think about this, here's 3 whalers, each of whom in those days were fundamentally millionaires, all of whom pursued their trade before the beginning of the Civil War.
Wow.
Okay.
Yes.
Now I found all this out. So I have the 52 black captains, whaling captains of color in this book. I found another dozen. Okay, so I've been able to flesh this out. The thing, here's the thing. The thing about African American history is fundamentally you can't read our history, not until we write it. Okay, that's just just a factor of how things are. In doing some research, I've been reading our paper, the Vineyard Gazette, all in the beginning. That's another longer story. But I came across a story at the bottom of the editorial page from 1869, and it's about one of the Vineyard's famous whale captains, Richard Flanders. He'd gone on 10 trips. He'd come back, full boats, probably with about $10 million in today's money, and earned about $1 million for himself over that period of time. At the end of his career, he had chosen to have a yacht built for himself, a little trinket, a reward, if you will, a tchotchke, and it was being built by a man named John Mashow. Now, if you had not studied and written the book that I wrote, you would not know who the hell John Mashow is, but he was a black man, formerly a slave. He was released from slavery by his father, who sent him to New Bedford, where he became the builder and designer of over 100 ships, many of which were whale ships, about 15 of which were used by my captains, one of which was sunken by the Shenandoah, one of which was sunken by the Alabama. Now, newspapers in those days felt it was kind of a racism to identify the race of a person in their newspaper stories. So had I not happened across that story in that 1869 newspaper, I would have not found out that a black boat designer from New Bedford built a yacht for a millionaire from Martha's Vineyard.
So
So
you're
that's
saying
a cool story I'm going to write.
That's amazing. And so
Yeah.
that because of that, there's so much in Black history that is yet to be unearthed.
Exactly. Now let me stop there and segue. You got all the nutcases down there in Florida and Texas, with this, critical race theory.
Yeah.
We should criticize people who had slaves. Yeah, I think we should. But in all candor, slavery is not a great story. I'm tired of it. I don't want to hear about it. My friends who are white, which are numerous, they never had slaves. They don't feel they should be, beholden, because this has happened. There are people who might disagree. So reparations is probably not something that we will see in our lifetimes, if ever. But suppose we were to take a certain amount of money and go back and have someone do stories and write about those 399,000 Black people who were brought here in the beginning days of slavery, who wound up being released as 3.9 million people at the end of the Civil War. So these people brought here and fundamentally grown like oranges, okay, to build this nation and this full economy that we have now. But maybe there's some better ways of telling these stories.
Well,
I choose to tell stories about, captains of color who got there based upon their abilities. That's the American story, up by your bootstraps.
yes.
There are a lot of stories like that.
Yes, I do want you to then speak about this. You call them the first, the first
Meritocracy.
Yes, the first meritocracy, the first American meritocracy. Explain that.
Okay.
Because some people will think of meritocracy American as something of a myth, because today there's connections and research showing that it's not entirely merit that gets people ahead. But in those days, there was nothing else but their valor. So I'll let you explain.
Okay. It broke down to a very, very simple proposition. About 28 to 30 men put their feet on a whale ship. They go out to sea thousands of miles. Whale trip, 10,000 miles is not out of the question. 2.5 the average, whale trip was 3.5 years, as I said. This is a whole lot of work, which unless your people desert, you're not getting new people on the boat. And the new people you get on the boat have no experience. So once you're 3,500 miles out at sea, and you haven't seen a bird for 1,000 miles, you haven't seen land in 3 or 4 days, something happens to the captain. He gets bitten by a whale, he falls off the boat, he breaks the whale or whatever. Who do you want? Who do you want to replace him to continue the voyage and catch the rest of the whales and get you home safely? Well, you want the one with the most experience. As luck would have it, the Black guys, the men of color who got on these ships had no other alternatives. They couldn't get a job on their cousin's farm. They didn't have the cousin of the farm. So they stayed aboard these ships year after year after year after year after year. Now, the only technological improvement in all of whaling in all of these years was a thing called Temple's toggle. And it was a Black man, a blacksmith over in New Bedford, who invented the thing on the spear, on the harpoon, that makes sure that it doesn't come out after you stick it in the whale. One technological improvement.
It's a toggle. God, clever.
Right. Now, let me draw a parallel for you. There's a statue to that man, all right, just outside the New Bedford Public Library, where I did a lot of research. That's one that talks about what he did. Probably 200 feet away from him, there's another statue of a man in a whaleboat. And, you cannot avoid noticing that the man with the harpoon in the whaleboat is a young white guy with blonde hair. There were no young white guys with blonde hair throwing harpoons that were improved by a Black man 100 places away. All right. But the people who did that knew the difference and did that on purpose.
I see. So it was not it. I see what you're saying. Okay.
And, so this meritocracy, that guy's got the most experience. We don't care if he's black, Native American, we don't care who he is. We know he can get us home. Okay. There were sometimes, when the captain himself, was hurt too badly to finish the voyage, and he would say, you're going to be the next captain. And at times, there happened to be, a man of color. So they don't care what your race is when lives are at stake.
Yes, yes.
Okay?
I think you pointed
Here's
out
a question that
that
people don't ask.
Yes, yes. And wouldn't you think too that men on board a ship for so many years, just the proximity of being together is a kind of equalizer, that it's hard to bear a prejudice against somebody who has helped you survive. Mm-hmm. Would you agree to that?
There was a substantially higher level of freedom aboard a whale ship than anywhere in the 13 colonies of America.
Interesting. As tough as it was.
On a whale ship, you could be a captain, you could flog another shipmate. You could throw a shipmate overboard if you were the captain. You were like a god if you were a captain aboard ship. And the men of color could do that as well. Okay. Yet when they got off those boats, which is why they did trip after trip after trip, with the money they earned, they couldn't buy land. They couldn't put their money in a bank. Okay. And their money didn't last. All right. Paul Cuffey, for example, one of the wealthier ones, not the wealthiest, and we'll go into that, but one of the wealthier ones, his funds did not last 2 generations. And he was fundamentally a millionaire. Where could you put your money to invest?
Of course.
He went out to sea to get that money and bring it back. Okay.
Well,
probably Richard Johnson that I've mentioned, who no one knows anything about, was substantially wealthier than Paul Cuffey. Okay. Paul Cuffey is characterized as a millionaire, and those dollars versus today's dollars, that's probably true. Paul Cuffey, I believe, was probably the 3rd wealthiest man of color in the country, which means, in the world. I think Richard Johnson was 2nd, and I forget the other guy's name, from Philadelphia, he was a sailmaker, was probably the 1st. James Fortin, was probably the wealthiest man, and they were all relative contemporaries. That didn't happen in the rest of America. So in the rest of America, don't care how good you are. Yeah. There are no lives at stake on a farm, for example.
Well, I would agree with you that those stories need to be told, so that it adds to our understanding of human behavior, understanding of how societies come together and how they align their values. We need to hear these, and I also think that we're to bring these characters, your captains of color, to bring them new life on the page is to pay them a kind of respect for their endurance. And so this is why I think it's very valuable, not just for us to understand the past, but also to pay tribute to them for their courage.
Well, and it's also a matter of just identifying them. Okay, but
yes,
it's like
exactly.
Like an enslaved person. Yes. If they were good at it, you'll never find out who they are.
Yeah,
and a lot of them went into whaling that we know.
What you've done is to rescue them from obscurity, and I think that's critical.
With a goal, with a purpose, to yes. Clearly portray these as people of consequence and accomplishment.
Yes.
And that tells a better story than somebody, being whipped out in the field somewhere, I think.
Exactly. And also this very realistic history of whaling. Most of us know a little bit about whaling, probably from certainly from novels that we've read. I'm thinking of Melville's Moby Dick. Now, in your book, you say that Melville romanticizes, but there are some accuracies in his book. But let's talk about what you think is romanticized.
Okay. First of all, the majority of Melville's book is as factual it can be for a fiction book. Okay. Some of the romanticism is, the relationship between the captain and the whale. That's nonsense. Yeah, that's just nonsense.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well,
there are too many reasons that can't happen.
Well, let me.
But let me go further. That doesn't mean it wasn't a wonderful story. I was probably a young teenager when I read it for the first time. However, let's put that in some perspective. Melville's book was published in 1851, and during Melville's lifetime, he sold 3,215 copies. Frederick Douglass' narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass was published in 1845 and sold 30,000 copies.
Yeah.
Big difference. Big difference.
Literary.
So Frederick Douglass's plight managed to capture the attention of the American people more so than this wonderful story about the white whale.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I think literary critics would say about Moby Dick that it's not about whaling; it's about a character.
Right. It's a metaphor. Exactly.
That's right.
There you go.
It's about
very good.
One.
You want to ask me a question? Is there such a thing as a white whale?
Yes.
Yes. I have proof of it. This is an article from Reader's Digest. Oh, I can't see the date. From 1957, when it's 25 cents. And there's a story here about a Martha's Vineyard man named Amos Smalley. And the title of the story is, I Killed Moby Dick.
Really?
Yeah. In fact, it was not Moby Dick, but yes, it was a white whale. It was a sperm whale that was 90 feet, which would have been larger than Moby Dick. That's a very big whale. But yes, he did kill that whale. Wow. So we have that as truth. Amos Smalley is, the Smalley family goes back here on Martha's Vineyard since, Noepe, since the original, people walked over here.
Another thing I find so interesting, and I've only realized that in reading your book, is that there is whale literature yet to be discovered. There's so much. Some of your books can be referred to. It's a wonderful reference book with the appendixes that you have and the bibliography. But there's so much.
Let me explain that. I'm a little bit of a character. I quit college 5 weeks before graduation to take my first job in the media. Never regretted, by the way, never looked back. But when you start writing nonfiction books, you don't have a lot of credibility without a college degree. So that's why, yes, I've got, 900 or so footnotes, and sources of where I found this information, so people can look it up and find it on their own if they would like to. But back to whales for a second. Well, the things we don't know about whales are remarkable. I had a friend of mine was in the submarine business for a while. I mentioned him. No, I don't know what he did in the sub, nor is he allowed to tell me. But submariners, call whales biologicals. They can't call them humans, and they can't call them fish. Technically, they're mammals. They bear their young alive. In our conversation, we know whales can talk. We believe whales have their own religion.
Yes.
Okay, whales, have the biggest brains, some of the smartest creatures on Earth. Whales have long lifespans. There may be whales swimming in the water today that were around since revolutionary times. We did not know whales were not fish until the period of whaling was over.
Really?
Yeah. And that's only scratching the surface about these magnificent creatures. We went out and killed things we didn't even know what they were.
Yes, they are, and the more one learns about whales, the more magnificent they seem to be ability to communicate, to nurture their young. It is, and so we are certainly
rather heart-rending at the New Bedford Whaling Museum, where I did most of my research. In their lobby, which is just fabulous, they've got the skeletons of a whale named Raina, which means queen, by the way, and her baby whale, right next to her. They're attached. They were hit by a ship, is what happened. So they kept them, they brought them back, they reduced them down to their bones. The baby whale, Raina, the bones look like your hand, look like a human hand. Yeah. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So with a little bit of effort, in theory, because whales have to come up, you could go out in the ocean and swim around with the whale, talk to it, pray with it, tell jokes, and you may find a way of understanding each other. That's the animal for hundreds of years, we slaughtered without knowing what they were.
And are continuing to endanger with our trash in the oceans, microplastics.
Yes, but not so many. There's a little bit of air in there, not so many as you would think. Right whales, there's a problem. Some of the humpback whales, I think there's only 600-700 of those left. But the rest of the whales, there's absolutely no problem with. They're proliferating, as you'd expect. Now, what else we don't realize, most whales, boats can't catch. The largest whale, the blue whale, you're talking 100-foot, 100-ton creature that probably swims close to 30 miles an hour. You're not catching one of those things in a,
it's kind of humbling. It makes one feel quite humble. Mm-hmm. They are so magnificent. And it's interesting, too, that our consciousness, sensitivity to the mysteries of nature has changed so much over the years. The American Indians, the indigenous people who taught the settlers how to catch whales, they needed to survive, so perhaps they can be forgiven.
Here's a selfish notion. There's some people in Connecticut. There's some people in Sag Harbor in Long Island. There are people in Nantucket, people here in Martha's Vineyard, who all claim whaling started with them.
Oh.
Now, that's very difficult to prove, but if one acknowledges the indigenous people, as I do, if one acknowledges, their customs were substantially different than our own, you'll recall that indigenous people, didn't leave their records in books and tapes and magazines. Okay, their history was voiced. Okay, so in their history, we know the story, of the godlike person called Noepe, which is the name of Martha's Vineyard, initially, who took his toe and carved it around a piece of land, and that's how Martha's Vineyard was founded. Okay, and to feed, his people, he would pick up whales and smack them against the Gay Head Cliffs, which is why the clay in those cliffs is red, so it is said. And he ultimately made his female children into striped bass, to feed the rest of people. Well, all these stories, over the years and everything else, they tell the story of when they used to go out, and no, I'm sorry. Let me go back. Everyone believes they began whaling because it was what's called drift whaling. The whale dies and finds itself on shore. They make packs. They put people together in little groups. They cut it up and they distribute it to the community. Okay, that's not whaling. That's garbage collecting. Yeah. Okay, whaling is when you go out there in the water, you row out there, you sail out there, you stab the thing, and you bring it back. The first time that occurred was on Martha's Vineyard. Nantucket claimed drift whaling, although they'd be the closest to being number one or number two as whaling actually started, because it was promulgated first on Nantucket. Okay, but to the extent that the indigenous community of Martha's Vineyard were the first ones to capture whales, I'm going with Martha's Vineyard. Of course, I live here.
Yes. And speaking of your being a resident there, I'd like to have you talk about one of your other books, and that is Tales of Oak Bluffs. Any whaling stories in that?
There may be some small ones about whalers, but that was one day I decided I was going to be a writer instead of a broadcaster, and I was offered an opportunity to be the Oak Bluffs town columnist for the Vineyard Gazette, which has been published since May 14th, 1846, which I did, and I wrote the column for about 5 years. And while I was doing that, along the way, the editor of Martha's Vineyard magazine that we own came down and said, he says, "Hey, the Charles W. Morgan has been refloated, the famous whale ship. It's also the second oldest ship in America after the Constitution. Is coming here to Martha's Vineyard. They had 7 black captains and many black crewmen over the years, so writing a big story about it, for the whole magazine. Wanted to know if you'd like to write a piece on the black captain from Martha's Vineyard." All I heard him say was write for the magazine. I'm not gonna lie. Okay, then I did some research on William A. Martin, the black captain from Martha's Vineyard, and was astounded to find out that not only was he a captain, but he wasn't the only captain, and was far from even being the first one. I think Martin was maybe the 30th or someplace in that range of 50 people. So that's when I started doing some research for that story. One thing led to another. I was completely blown away. There was such a thing as black people before the Civil War being captains of anything. So I got lost. I'm ADHD and OCD, which is really cool if you're writing a book.
Yes.
People ask my process, how'd you do this? I mentioned earlier, I read kind of fast. So I went out and started buying and reading whaling books. Over my shoulder, that shoulder, those shelves over there, those are all whaling books. So I don't know. I was 60 days into, studying how to write this book, and my wife came in and she says, "What the hell's going on? You spent like $5,000 on Amazon on books." So that's the kind of ADHD carried away part, and the OCD, I need to focus and get this information.
I think that's the story of a writer who has found his subject, which is a great thing to have.
Okay, so the first 100 whaling books, contribute to the book. I'm now to 190, which is another way of saying I'm pretty sure I own all the whaling books, and I've read them all, trying to find this information, because much of it, if you find it at all, you're going to find it by accident. Okay, here's an example. In the New Bedford Public Library, where I went to do research, they have essentially a card catalog, with whalers' names and and information. There are 131 drawers, each of which has, 400 or 500 cards in it. I read them all, just to find out some of these people. And yes, I did find the names of people I wouldn't know. In almost every single situation where you see them, this person listed as a crewman, a harpooner, or something like that, no captains are listed by race.
Fascinating, isn't that interesting?
No captains. You can't find it anywhere. On logs, on ship's logs, never anywhere does it say that this was a man of color. So you've got to make those determinations. So that's why you have to go read whole card catalogs to identify these folks.
Yes. Well, think of what stories lie in ship's logs that are yet to be read. I would think that that's a novelist gold mine.
Well, if I never read another log again in my whole life, that's going to be just fine. It's worse reading. It's logs are stultifying reading. Okay, well, you think you're going to pick up a storybook or something? No, they give the weather that happened that day, and they repeat that throughout the rest of the voyage.
What? No poetry?
Very little. Yes, there's a little bit of poetry in some. Yes, there's some drawings, artwork, in some. But most of the time, it's just boring. Now, if you think about it, the owners of these whale ships don't know anything about what's going on. Okay? Right. So the captain is only going to tell them so much. After 1850, you were not allowed to flog a whaleman. Now, you know damn well they flog whalemen after that, but you're not going to put that in your log, sir, just as an example. So it's terrible, terrible reading. And anyone who's ever read one will repeat that comment, sorry to say.
And I will
and hard
not
to read because they're difficult, the handwriting.
handwriting. Oh my goodness. I know the Falmouth Public Library has a number of logs and volunteers do them. So you're right.
New Bedford, I believe, the New Bedford.
I had some.
I think they've got the most. They've got close to 3,000 of them.
Yes, I had some romantic notions that one might write another, find something in a log that would have someone write another Moby Dick, but I'll give that up after what you've said. It's too much work. Too much work. But certainly there is now, I would think, academic study of whaling. It seems to me that there is much there still that would a resource for someone who is interested in finding out more about it. The kinds of information that you say is right now lost, and so you depend.
Most of the most useful information is going to be a weather factor. Okay, now we have an industry here that helped build a country that cannot be replicated. There's no future in this. I think most industrial minds thinking is more oriented towards the future than the past. Okay, I don't think there's going to be a whole lot more attention to this whaling. I do know I've talked to most of the people in whaling, as you can imagine everything. They're delighted with my book because it brings new attention, new light of day to an industry that's hasn't had it for some period of time. The New Bedford Whaling Museum, they have, besides having a Paul Cuffey room, which is outstanding, they have a room with scrimshaw. I will bet you that room is probably worth more than the building that it's in. This is hand done artwork aboard whale ships that are just fabulous.
Oh, really? Yes.
Oh goodness. Please. And they've used this whale bone to make all kinds of different things, from umbrellas to toys, to these little devices to spin yarn on. Just beautiful.
Yeah, hoops for women's skirts, right?
Well, right, exactly.
And I think we mustn't forget. I think that it's very important to pay tribute to those men who. I will never again complain about air conditioning on a hot summer day when I think about the kind of suffering that they did. And they couldn't complain. So they were made of pretty stern stuff, and maybe we need to remember that.
Well, we can say that, but they were a captive audience.
Yes.
These were not the majority of them were not people of consequence.
Okay, that's true. They were. They were put.
People who went whaling really couldn't do anything else.
Right. They were put to a test that most of us will never encounter, and so that makes it quite different.
I've just been spending some time with Captain William Bill Pinckney, African American man, one of 4 people who sailed around the entire world himself in 22 months. Now, I couldn't even be with myself for 22 months. I just sailed around the world. With the potential option, a 47-foot boat. So, you have the option of drowning as well. But these definitely were men of fortitude, except for the reality of fact is they couldn't get off the boat. And probably as many of a third of them were kidnapped anyway.
Yes. And if they got off the boat, they'd have been...
They're gone.
Yeah.
They tried to run away.
Yeah, right. So it's a sad story. But your book is fascinating, and I would hope that viewers would want to get it and read it, because it is so packed with information that it's quite new to most of us who really don't know. As you say, a lot of this information wasn't available and is still much of it still to be discovered.
Yeah, I knew nothing of it. Nothing at all. So it was all brand new, but it was so much. Now, since I've begun the book, there's a new major resource available. The Mystic Seaport, the New Bedford Whaling Museum. Oh, I'm lost.
We've lost you.
Oh, there we go. Okay. The New Bedford Whaling Museum, and Judith Lund, who wrote this book, about American whaling, they produced a brand new website. It's called whalinghistory.org. Whalinghistory.org. And if you think one of your ancestors was a whaler, you can type your name in and it'll tell you almost immediately.
Oh, that's wonderful. Oh, yeah. That is great.
Yeah, that'd have been real helpful when I started writing this book.
Yes. And we could encourage viewers too to visit the New Bedford Whaling Museum. The New Bedford,
it's a treasure.
Yes,
it's a treasure.
Right.
And there are, Long Island. There's one. Certainly Nantucket. I've been to most of them.
Yes.
I mean, it's a subject that now really intrigues me. Let me introduce something different, which is made it somewhat difficult to find these guys as well. Slave ship, 2 slave ships. Female slave gets off the boat pregnant, has a child. She's very dark-skinned. The dad, very fair-skinned. The child, light-skinned. Same thing happens on that other whale ship over there. Those 2 kids get married. So they went from half Black or Indigenous, okay, to now 1/4, to then 1/8, and on and on and on and on and on. That's a term called hypodescence, if you will. And the reason they use that, so no matter how fair-skinned you were, or how straight your hair, or how blue your eyes, if your mom was Black, you're my slave. Okay, and in 1792 and 1850, they had the Fugitive Slave Acts, and they could go after you and say, that person's my slave, and I'm going to take you back. And the reward was greater, for bringing the slave back than not. So these are some of the factors, that enter in, to whaling, is who's Black and who's not. And when I originally did the book, it was African Americans and Blacks. So I met with a couple of my buddies over in New Bedford, members of the Cape Verdean community. I'm like, how you all feeling about this? They didn't like that. Like, they like people of color. Okay, so over our history, sidebar story. I grew up here in the island, during the summers. My friends, Black, white, Cape Verdean, or whatever. The Cape Verdeans did not want to be considered Black. They did not want to be discriminated against. They did not want to be treated like African Americans were treated, over all these years. So I had a friend, I'm not going to mention his name, and he's substantially darker than I am. Right? He says, oh no, I'm not Black. I'm like, dude, you better go look in the mirror. Because that's what I see. And all these white guys out here, they see that too. That didn't change until the Cape Verdean community that escaped from Cape Verde to come here. And, when they escaped something different. They had drought. They had people die because they had no water. So when they came over here, to America, they were treated like Black people. They got the worst of the jobs available. They got the worst pay, if you will. My 2 friends said, but if you call people of color, then that's inclusive. Okay, because the same thing happened with the Indigenous community here on Martha's Vineyard. The Earl report in the 1800s was charged with identifying the Native American and Black community, here in Martha's Vineyard, to tabulate how many there were. This man came out with a report saying there were no Native Americans on Martha's Vineyard. Tell them apart. Well, in the research of Black whaling captains or Black anybody, you have that factor to deal with. Okay, I'm not going to mention name, but there is a captain, not a whaling captain, a very famous captain out on the West Coast during these times. Okay, who we know for a fact, mom and dad were both Black, but he's very fair-skinned, and he identifies as white. Identified as white. So there are all these things that kind of fit together, these, to puzzle this story out.
I know.
And I don't like to say it, but it gets down to racism. It's just
Yes, and there is a view that there is only one race, and that's the human race, and that racism is a social construct. That even the term racism entered the language at a particular time and place. So it's
that's a portable one.
Yes, and so in nature there is no such thing. There's only variety, as we see everywhere. So it's that social construct. It's the social structure that it creates these issues. Mm-hmm. And I'm so that everything we can do to understand that is so important.
Yeah, but it's better, do the work, do the homework, do the research, find the proof, tell the story.
Yeah. I want to, before we close, because we're running out of time, I wanted to delve into your personal life, and especially your turning to writing in your retirement. I have a sense that anyone who writes as well as you do must have had that interest in the printed word for a long time. Well, so your career was in media, not in the printed word.
I like to describe myself as a hard-working media type. So yes, I started my career in television. I went into radio. I've done advertising and then back into radio, and I've done that for probably 45 of my 50-some year, career. So yes, I've been a salesperson and a manager and a sales manager, but for the last half or 3/4 of my career, I was pretty much a suit. And my job was to make sure radio stations and radio station companies ran well, made money, and was able to finance acquisitions for more radio stations. So those are amongst my responsibilities. So I get the money thing, in the banking. I'm very familiar with all that, so that was easy to enter into this. I'm also, I think a lot of people would say, a little eccentric, probably. But I've had a wonderful growing up. I'm a obviously Black guy who has been able to use the expression summer home since 1955. Now the expression summer home, that's a hell of a term for anybody anywhere. But imagine what it's like, be Black to have one. Or to put that in some perspective, when my dad bought that 8-bedroom home at the end of the first block from the beach in the historic district of the town of Oak Bluffs for $4,500 in 1955, he had to buy from his lawyer.
Wow. Yeah. So you had.
That's what.
Yeah, you have a story to tell, and so.
Yeah. It's so my story. I'm not gonna be the one to have any credibility to talk about the Black experience. Okay, you don't grow up in Long Island. Mom's a stay-at-home. You've got help. You've got a summer home. I get that. I certainly understand that, but I'm not an idiot. Over all those years, the reason I kind of rose to the executive stardom, if you will, and most people in radio still know the name, and I've been on the cover of a bunch of magazines and written about quite a bit for my accomplishments, by the way. I did a lot of writing. When you want to, I did $500 million worth of radio first transactions. When you go out and borrow $250 million from someone, you need to know how to write. Exactly. You need to be able to write a story and convince that person why they should give you the money and how they're going to get their money back. So that's when my writing started. So it's easy, so I had the words are easy. I've got a huge vocabulary. I read extraordinarily fast. I mean, when I was in junior high school and high school, you can take one book out of the library. They let me take out as many books as I wanted.
Oh, so you've always been a reader.
Yeah. in an English class, when they assign you your book report, I would hand it in at the end of the class.
Right. Yeah.
So that ability to read allowed me to cut a lot of corners over the years. So I was able to read a 600-page textbook 2 or 3 times the night before the test and get a C- and the hell with it. Move on.
Excellent. So the great thing is that you took your gift and you wrote this book, and it is such a delightful read, and both serious, interesting, and as I said earlier, I think it's a tribute to those captains who endured, and kind of like sort of a model for what a human being can do and be. So
let me circle back to the Charles W. Morgan. So as luck would have it, since the book came out, I do a lot of speaking, to people about the book, and they ask questions, things. One of those happened to be at Mystic Seaport. So, if I did my presentation at the end, I said, I really have to thank you folks, for the Charles W. Morgan, because its first captain, 7 of its captains over the years, many of its men were from Martha's Vineyard. As when not only that, but its last captain and its entire crew were men of color. Well, I didn't realize several of the board of directors of the Seaport were on the call, and they're like, what? They had no idea.
Yeah, interesting.
That was a few years ago. Since then, all those people are identified on the dock at the Charles W. Morgan. I've joined the Mystic Seaports, board of trustees, and
Good.
more to come.
Yeah.
But we owe a lot to the Charles W. Morgan. It precipitated more than anything else this book.
Yes, your inspiration. I thank you so much for this. It has been such a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
And viewers, thank you for viewing, and I look forward to seeing you next time on Conversations with Barbara. So long.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.